Hi everyone and welcome to the first episode of Korean Studios Podcast. My name is Kim Gi-hwan. Through our podcast, we want to help you learn not just Korean language, but also about Korean culture. As I think understanding the Korean culture will help you to understand why Korean language is used in a certain way. And today we're going to take a look at the topic of addressing people in Korea. As you may know already, addressing people in Korea is rather different from other countries, largely because of the hierarchical nature of Korean society. So in Korea, we use many different terms to address people depending on the hierarchical nature of our relationship with the people we're speaking to. So today, we're going to provide you with a comprehensive guide on different terminologies you can use to address people in Korea. Okay, so let's first take a look at what we will go over today. First, we have name. Then we'll take a look at how we use 씨 and then 님. After that, we'll look at how we use the terms 형, 오빠, 누나, 언니. And after that, we'll learn about the terms 어머니, 아버지, as well as 어머님, 아버님, and learn how we use it to address not only our parents, but also other people. And then we'll finally round off by looking at the terms 아줌마 and 아저씨. So let's begin with names. Now, calling people by their names is very casual in Korea. So unless you're talking to someone of the same age or those who are below you in the hierarchy, you shouldn't call people by their names. Additionally, if you're an adult, if someone is of the same age or younger, you should only call people by their name if you are close to them. When we do address people by their names, we have to add the syllables 아 or 야, depending on whether the name ends in 받침 or not. If a name ends in 받침, we add 아. But if a name doesn't end in 받침, then we add 야. So my name ends in 받침, so my parents would address me as 기완아. But if my name was 민수, then it would be 민수야. Now, there are two main situations where you can address people by their name. One is between close friends, and by friends, I mean people who are of the same age. In Korea, because our social hierarchy is established based on age, only those of the same age are regarded as being true friends. The other is when you're addressing a younger family member. So if you're addressing your younger siblings, cousins, nephews and nieces, and definitely your own children and your grandchildren, you can address them by their name. One relationship in the family where we have specific titles, even for younger people in the family, is the spouse of our younger siblings. And this is largely because there is no guarantee that the spouse of our younger siblings will be younger than us. And in certain situations, the husband or wife of our younger siblings may actually be older than us. So when we address them, we normally add 씨 at the end of these titles to address them. However, it's important to note that this rule is quite flexible. In some families, the spouse of younger siblings may have close relations to the in-laws. And in these families, the older sibling may just address the younger sibling's wife or husband by their name. So there is some flexibility. Now, one other thing to note is that although in most work settings you would address each other using job titles, in certain casual workplaces, such as in gyms and restaurants, because of the casual nature of the work environment, if, let's say, the owner of the gym has close relations with some of his or her staff, then the owner may address the staff using their names. But this is only in casual workplaces. And in more formal corporate work environments, addressing people by names is extremely rare. And it may only happen between colleagues of the same age who have become close friends. And even then, they may only address each other using names outside of the work environment, as generally it's not proper to address people by name at work in Korea. Okay, next up we have 씨. 씨 is used at the end of names to address people in formal settings, but only those of similar age or rank. And this is the important thing to remember, as you should never use 씨 to address people if the other person has seniority. The most common setting where we use 씨 is at workplace, and it's most commonly used among entry-level staff who are yet to be given a job title. Now, in many Korean workplaces, for entry-level staff or junior member of staff, rather than being given a job title based on their role, they're given a general title called 사원. 사원. So whether your role is technical support in the IT department or sales representative, you're just called 사원. 사원 is shortened from 회사원, and 회사 means a company or office, and 원 means an employee or staff. So 회사원 can be loosely translated to mean an office worker. And in Korea, as you move up the corporate ladder, you're then given various other titles, such as 대리, 과장, and 부장. And these job titles are referred to as 직급, which relates more to your position in the corporate hierarchy rather than what you actually do. And once you're given these titles, you're then addressed by these titles. So if I'm 대리 and my supervisor wants to address me, he might call me 김대리. So we add the surname in front of 대리. And those below me in the corporate hierarchy, or those of the same level, would address me as 대리님. 대리님. And as we will learn shortly after, 님 is a more respectful term than 씨. However, 사원 is not a 직급. So it is generally not used to address the person who is a 사원. And this is where we can use 씨 to address each other. In Korea, those who join the company together at entry-level position are called 동기. And all 동기 are considered as same rank. And even amongst 동기, there can be a significant age gap, especially between men and women, as Korean men have to do mandatory military service. However, even if there is a significant age gap, let's say 5 or 6 years between two 동기, as those joining the company together at the same time are considered as being equal, 동기, they would address each other using 씨 at the end of each other's names. Now, other than workplace, another place where 씨 is commonly used is when two people are out on a date. But it does depend a little on how the date has come about. For example, if two people who are familiar to each other are on a date, then they wouldn't address each other using 씨, as they are already close to each other. And 씨 is not used between people who are already close. However, in Korea, there is something called 소개팅. 소개팅. 소개 means an introduction, and 팅 comes from the word meeting, which is a form of Konglish we use to talk about people going on dates. So 소개팅 is when two people go on a date through an introduction from mutual friends. And in these days, the two people are meeting for the first time. And regardless of the age gap between the two people, since two people on a date are regarded as their equals, they would address each other using 씨. Now, if the two people decide to become a couple and the woman is younger than the man, then the woman would address the man as 오빠. But for the first few dates, they would address each other using 씨. Now, as mentioned before, we also use 씨 at the end of family titles for the spouse of younger siblings. So 씨 is also used in certain other contexts. But these two are the two most common ways of using 씨 in Korea. Okay, so let's now move on and take a look at the term 님. Now, similar to 씨, we can add 님 after names and various job titles. However, 님 is a much more formal term than 씨, and also a very respectful term. So although we can add 님 after names, it's not used in social settings. And the use of 님 after names is only common in certain contexts where you are there to receive a service or to buy something. So if you're at a hospital, at an airport, or at a hairdresser's, then people working at that place may address you as 김기환님, 김기환님. And as you can see, you're generally addressed by your full name. However, in most places, they would only know your name if they have your information. So if your name is not known to the people who are serving you, then they will address you as 고객님 or 손님, which both mean customer. Now, as we briefly went over before, one of the most common uses of 님 is in the workplace. And 님 is added to your job titles. So it's common for people to refer to each other as 대리님, 부장님, and so on. However, if someone higher up in the hierarchy is addressing someone below the hierarchy, then they'll just say 김대리 or 김부장. So it's the surname plus your 직급, your rank. Additionally, 님 is often added to names of profession. Some jobs are commonly known with 님 attached, such as 선생님, but if you're at the hospital and you want to address the nurse, you can call the nurse 간호사님, and to address the taxi driver, you would say 기사님. So if your relationship with that person is related to their profession, then you can address them using 님 at the end of their job title. Now, as well as these uses, we can also use 님 after certain family titles. For example, to address the spouse of our older siblings, rather than 씨, we would add 님 at the end of relevant family titles. Okay, so let's now consider how we use 형, 오빠, 누나, and 언니. Now, if you didn't know already, 형, 오빠, 누나, and 언니 are terms we use to address our older siblings. And we have 4 terms because men use 형 and 누나 to address older brothers and sisters, while women use 오빠 and 언니 to address older brothers and sisters. And as well as direct siblings, we can also use these terms to address older cousins. Now, in Korea, we also use the terms 형, 오빠, 누나, and 언니 to address older men and women when we meet people in social settings. And to the terms 형 and 누나, we can also add 님. So they become 형님 and 누님. And I think the way we add 님 to these terms is a reflection of how conservative Korean men are. When Korean adults meet each other for the first time, they will start off by using formal language. And once they have formed a certain close relations, they can start using more informal language. However, this transition tends to happen much slower for men. And because these 4 terms are generally somewhat casual terms, Korean men would use 형님 and 누님 rather than 형 and 누나. Using just 형 and 누나 can feel a little awkward, especially for men who are in their 30s and over, as older Koreans tend to be more conservative than young Koreans. Now, on the other hand, Korean women tend to start using casual language with each other much more quickly. And I must admit, I don't know if this is the reason why, but we never add 님 after 오빠 and 언니. They are always used as 오빠 and 언니. Now, one other thing to note with the term 오빠 is that there is a certain connotation of how it's used by women to address their boyfriends. And in typical Korean couple relationships, women tend to be younger than men. So there's a certain connotation of how 오빠 is used as a term of endearment between couples. So if a woman knows that an older man likes her, then she might resist addressing him as 오빠, as she doesn't want to give the wrong impression. But this doesn't mean that she will be impolite and call him by his name, but she may try to avoid having to address that person using the term 오빠. This is, of course, just a very particular scenario, but the important point is that 오빠 does have this connotation of being used as a term of endearment between couples. Okay, so next up we have 아버지 and 어머니. And as you may know already, 아버지 and 어머니 mean mother and father. And nearly all grown-up adult men and women in Korea address their parents as 아버지 and 어머니. Children will address their parents as 아빠 and 엄마. But as they get older, they will use 아버지 and 어머니, which are more formal. In Korea, and I think it may be similar in other countries, but most people tend to have closer relations with their mothers than their fathers. So it's quite common for adult men and women to still address their mothers as 엄마. But you will rarely find, particularly adult male, because men tend to be more conservative, use the term 아빠 to address their fathers. Some Korean women do use the term 아빠 to address their fathers. Now, as well as your own parents, you can also address your friends' parents as 아버지 and 어머니. And if you need or want to be more formal, maybe you've only just met them, you don't know them very well, then you can add 님 to 아버지 and 어머니 and say 아버님 and 어머님. Now, addressing friends' parents as 아버지 and 어머니 is only by adults. If children want to address their friends' parents, they would use 아저씨 and 아줌마, which we will discuss a little later. Now, there are also other contexts where we can use 아버지 and 어머니. Generally, when parents take children to different kinds of shops, schools, or hospitals, the people working in that place will address the mother or the father, as in the children's father or the mother, as 어머니 or 아버지. And they may add 님 at the end if they want to be more polite and respectful. So school teachers tend to address the students' parents using these terms. A shoe store staff selling kids' shoes will address the child's parents using these terms. And doctors and nurses at pediatricians will address the child's parents as 어머니 and 아버지, or 어머님 and 아버님. Lastly, if I see an old lady about my mother's age get on the subway and I want to give my seat to her, then I would address her as 어머니. However, for you to use this term to just random old ladies, it's very important that they do look very old, or they are very old, as it would be somewhat inappropriate to use these terms if the other person is only a little bit older than us. Okay, so the final two terms we're going to look at are 아줌마 and 아저씨. Now, we use 아줌마 and 아저씨 when we address either middle-aged or married men and women. And these terms are commonly used by children when they address adult male and female. Generally, it's less common for adults to use these terms, and the only common setting where you might address someone as 아줌마 and 아저씨 is in casual shops and restaurants. And when you do address someone as 아줌마 or 아저씨, there has to be a significant age gap between you and the other person. For example, if a 24-year-old man goes to a restaurant and he can clearly see that the woman serving him is at least 50, then he can address that person as 아줌마. However, if for whatever reason you think that the woman serving you could be in her late 30s, then it's best that you avoid calling her 아줌마, because if you met this person in a social setting, you could call her 누나 rather than 아줌마. So this aspect of determining whether someone looks old enough to be called 아줌마 can make using this term rather awkward, because you're essentially looking at someone's appearance and making a judgment that, oh, she must be at least 20 years older than me, so I'll call her 아줌마. And Korean men definitely care less about being called 아저씨, but Korean women can be offended if you call them 아줌마, and it turns out that they are actually not that old, and it will probably show on their facial expression. So there is a certain connotation that's attached to the term 아줌마. And to give you an example of this connotation, if your sister bought some new clothes and it looks rather old-fashioned, you might say to her, that's really 아줌마 style. 그거 너무 아줌마 스타일이야. And this means that the new clothes look old, something an old lady would wear. So this word 아줌마 has kind of become synonymous with being related to an older lady like. And for this reason, even unmarried women in their late 20s or early 30s do not like being called 아줌마 by children. So they might say something like 나는 아줌마 아니야, meaning I'm not 아줌마, to say that I'm still single and I'm not dressed like an old lady. They don't want to be associated with that word. So overall, although I think children don't have to be so careful when addressing someone as 아줌마 and 아저씨, because I think children are allowed to make occasional innocent mistakes, adults should be quite careful. And although there is no written rule on how big that age gap should be for you to address someone using these terms, I always think it's better to be safe than sorry. So a safe age gap for you to call someone 아줌마 would be about 20. So if you're 30, then you should be absolutely certain that the other person is at least 50 for you to call that person 아줌마. Now, having said that, if you are not sure, then I think you should address that person in other ways. And particularly in shops, you can just say 저기요, which is a way of saying excuse me to catch someone's attention. And definitely avoid using these terms entirely if you are uncertain of the age gap, because if you get it wrong, the situation could turn rather sour. Okay, so we've gone over a lot of different terms that we can use to address people in Korea. I know that's a lot of information to take in, but I hope that's given you a good overview of all the different ways of addressing people in Korea. If you're watching or listening to this on a platform other than our website, then do visit our website where you can download a lesson summary sheet related to today's episode. The link is in the description below. Thank you for watching or listening today, and I look forward to seeing you soon again. Bye bye.